The messenger boy dropped the envelope at her feet without even looking at her. He was maybe 16, with a smirk that belonged to someone who had delivered bad news so many times it had become entertainment. He didn't wait for a response. He just turned around and walked back toward the station office, whistling. Margaret Ellison stood on the platform and stared at the envelope. Around her, the other passengers were already moving. Men with purposes, women with families waiting, children running toward open arms. The train exhaled one long breath of steam and began pulling away. She watched it go. Then she looked down at the envelope again. Her name was written on the front in a hand she didn't recognize. She opened it. "You are not what I expected. I am sorry for the inconvenience. Please find your own arrangements." That was all. No signature, no explanation, no decency. If you've ever been told that your age makes you worth less, if you've ever felt like the world stopped seeing you, stay with this story. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what happens next. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to know how far this story has traveled. The wind off the Montana plain was the kind that didn't ask permission. It came through the station like it owned the place, lifting the hem of Margaret's coat, pulling loose strands of gray hair across her face. She didn't move to fix them. She stood on the platform with the note in one hand and the empty space where a man was supposed to be standing, and she did the only thing she had any energy left to do. She folded the paper carefully and put it in her coat pocket. Her leather suitcase sat beside her left boot. It was old, the brass clasps turning green at the corners. The leather cracked along the side seam where she'd repaired it herself with a needle and waxed thread 2 winters ago. Inside it was everything she had brought with her. 2 dresses, a pair of work boots, her late husband's pocket watch, and a small tin of buttons she'd been collecting for 30 years without any particular reason except that they were beautiful and no one could take them away from her. The station at Harlan Creek, Montana Territory, was not much to look at. A single platform of weathered planks, a ticket office with a window so dusty you could barely see through it, 2 wooden benches, both occupied by men who were pointedly not looking at her, a hand-painted sign that said Harlan Creek, Pop, 214, though someone had crossed out 214 and written 209 in pencil beneath it. 5 people had left or died, and nobody had bothered to repaint the sign. Margaret thought that said something about this town. She wasn't sure yet what. She picked up her suitcase and walked to the bench nearest the station wall, out of the wind, and sat down. She set the suitcase between her feet. She put her hands in her lap. And she thought about what she was going to do next with the kind of cold, deliberate focus that only comes from having had no good options for a very long time. She was 56 years old. She had buried a husband, raised 3 children who were now scattered across 2 states, and who wrote letters at Christmas and forgot her birthday. She had worked in a dry goods store in Ohio for 11 years, managed the books for a lumber company in Indiana for 4, and spent the last 2 years in a boarding house in St. Louis where the landlady charged extra for hot water, and the other tenants pretended not to hear when she cried at night. When the letter came from a man named Gerald Foss, saying he was a rancher in Montana Territory, looking for a practical-minded woman to share a life with, Margaret had read it 3 times in one sitting. Then she had written back. They had exchanged letters for 5 months. He had seemed steady. He had seemed honest. He had written about his land and his cattle and the way the light fell across the hills in late afternoon, like it was trying to say something important. She had believed him. That was the part she kept coming back to, sitting on the bench in the wind. Not the rejection itself. She had been rejected before by life, by circumstance, by men who couldn't see past the lines on her face. What stayed with her was the believing. She had let herself believe it. And now here she was. A boy from the station office, the same smirking messenger, came out and leaned against the doorframe. He looked at her with the particular cruelty of someone who had not yet learned what years could do to a person. "Ma'am," he said, not unkindly but not kindly either. "Last westbound train already left. Eastbound doesn't come until Thursday." "Today is Tuesday," Margaret said. "Yes, ma'am." "Thank you," she said. He waited as if expecting her to ask him something else, or perhaps to cry, or to do whatever abandoned women were supposed to do at train stations in the Montana Territory in the autumn of 1879. When she did none of those things, he went back inside. Margaret looked out at the main street of Harlan Creek. From where she sat, she could see a general store, a livery stable, what appeared to be a law office, and a saloon with a sign that said "Cold Beer, Warm Welcome," in letters that were neither confident nor accurate. A woman in a good coat was walking quickly past without looking at the station. Two old men sat in chairs outside the barber shop. A dog was asleep in the middle of the road. She thought, there is work somewhere in this town. There is always work. You just have to find out where they need someone badly enough to stop asking questions about where she came from. She stood up, picked up her suitcase, and walked toward the general store. The bell above the door announced her arrival to a man behind the counter who was perhaps 60, heavy-set, with the kind of mustache that suggested he had grown it to compensate for something. He looked up from his ledger. "Help you?" "I'm looking for work," Margaret said. She set her suitcase down but kept her hand on the handle. "I have experience in inventory, bookkeeping, and managing a retail store. I also cook, I can mend, and I am not afraid of hard work." The man's expression shifted through several calculations. "We don't have anything. My wife handles the store with me. Is there anyone in town who needs household help? A family, perhaps? Or a working man who needs someone to manage a house? Most folks around here manage themselves." "Of course," Margaret said. "Thank you for your time." She picked up her suitcase and went back out to the street. The woman in the good coat had stopped outside what appeared to be a millinery shop and was watching her with undisguised curiosity. Margaret walked over to her. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm new to town and I'm looking for work. Do you know of anyone who might be hiring?" The woman, mid-40s, sharp-eyed, with the kind of careful politeness that could turn into gossip by supper time, looked her over. "What kind of work?" "Whatever is needed," Margaret said. "Housekeeping, cooking, mending, bookkeeping. I'm experienced." "What brought you to Harlan Creek?" Margaret kept her voice even. "A misunderstanding. I'm here now, and I'm looking to make myself useful." The woman's eyes softened slightly, which meant she had already figured out the shape of the misunderstanding. Word traveled fast in small towns. The boy who had delivered the note had probably told someone already. "There's a widow on Elm Street, Mrs. Pratt, who's been poorly. She might need help around the house." "Thank you," Margaret said. "And where's Elm Street?" 3 blocks north. Turn left." Margaret thanked her again and started walking. She had not eaten since breakfast on the train, a dry biscuit and weak coffee that she'd paid 30 cents for because there was nothing else. Her feet hurt. The suitcase had grown heavier with every block, the way luggage always did when you were carrying it through uncertainty. But she walked at a steady pace, not fast, not slow, with her spine straight and her chin level, because she had learned something long ago that nobody had taught her directly. How you carry yourself in a bad moment is the only thing you can control. Mrs. Pratt's house was narrow and brown with a small porch that sagged on one side. Margaret knocked. A long pause. Then slow footsteps. The door opened on a woman who was perhaps 70, thin as a winter branch, with bright eyes that still had plenty of fight in them, even if her body was losing ground. "I'm not buying anything," the old woman said. "I'm not selling," Margaret said. "I was told you might need some help. I'm looking for work. My name is Margaret Ellison." Mrs. Pratt looked at her. "Who told you that?" "A woman outside the millinery shop. I didn't get her name." "That would be Louise Garrett." Mrs. Pratt's expression suggested that Louise Garrett's helpfulness was not always as helpful as it appeared. "I can't pay much." "I'm not asking for much," Margaret said. I need a place to sleep, meals, and a small wage if you can manage it. I'll do your cooking, your cleaning, and whatever else needs doing." Mrs. Pratt stepped back from the door. "Well, come in and let me look at you in the light." Margaret came in. The house smelled of old wood and liniment and the particular staleness that settles into rooms when a person has been too unwell to open windows. The parlor had a thin layer of dust on every flat surface. The kitchen, visible through the hallway, had dishes stacked in the basin that hadn't been washed recently. Mrs. Pratt stood in the middle of the parlor and looked at Margaret the way Margaret had looked at ledgers all her working life, searching for inconsistencies, checking the numbers. "You're not young," the old woman said. "No," Margaret agreed. "Neither am I. My last girl was 23 and she ran off to get married. Pretty useless until she did." Mrs. Pratt lowered herself into an armchair with the careful dignity of someone managing considerable pain without wanting to show it. "My hip went bad 2 winters ago. I can't manage the stairs anymore. I sleep in the back room now. I can manage the stairs, Margaret said. There are 6 chickens in the back. I can't get out to them every morning. I can manage the chickens. I burn everything I try to cook. I don't. Mrs. Pratt was quiet for a moment. You've had a bad day, she said finally. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't entirely sympathetic. It was simply an observation, the kind that older women made when they recognized a particular look in another woman's face. Yes, Margaret said. I have. Well, Mrs. Pratt gestured at the kitchen. The dishes are in the basin. If you start there, I'll know whether you're worth keeping. Margaret took off her coat, hung it on the hook by the door, pushed up her sleeves, and went to work. She was halfway through the dishes when she heard the front door of the station across town bang open in the wind, but she didn't know that yet. She didn't know that at that exact moment, a man named Nathaniel Crow was standing on that platform trying to decide whether to say something to an empty bench. She didn't know any of that. She knew there was hot water in the kettle and cold grease on a cast iron pan, and that the window above the basin looked out on a yard where 6 brown chickens were doing exactly what chickens did when nobody was paying attention to them. She washed the dishes, then she found a rag and wiped down the counters. Then she located a broom behind the back door and swept the kitchen floor because the state of it bothered her. Then she put the kettle on again and found, after some searching through the pantry, the makings of a decent soup, an onion that was still mostly good, half a head of cabbage, dried beans that needed soaking, a ham hock wrapped in cloth on the shelf. The beans would need overnight soaking. She set them in a bowl with water and made a note to herself. Instead, she put together a broth with the ham hock and the onion and the cabbage and let it go on the stove. And by the time the light outside had shifted toward late afternoon, the kitchen smelled like something warm and actual. Mrs. Pratt appeared in the doorway leaning on a cane Margaret hadn't noticed before. You can cook, the old woman said. I told you I could. People tell me a lot of things. Mrs. Pratt sniffed the air with something close to appreciation. There's a small room at the back, past the pantry. It has a cot and a window. It's not much. It's more than I had an hour ago, Margaret said. That night, Margaret lay on the narrow cot in the back room and stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind work at the edges of the house. The note from Gerald Foss was still in her coat pocket. She hadn't thrown it away. She wasn't entirely sure why. Maybe because it was evidence, maybe because she needed to remember exactly what had been done so that she didn't waste energy pretending it hadn't happened. She was not going to cry about Gerald Foss. She had made a mistake in trusting him, and she was going to do what she always did with mistakes, which was to acknowledge them clearly, put them away, and concentrate on what came next. What came next was unclear, but she had a cot, a roof, and work. She had managed with less. She slept. She was at the back of Mrs. Pratt's yard the next morning, scattering feed for the chickens, when she heard the creak of the gate in the side fence. She turned around with the feed bucket still in her hand. A man was standing at the gate. He was perhaps 45 or 50, tall, with the particular build of someone who had spent decades doing work that required his whole body. Wide through the shoulders, weathered in the face, with hands that looked like they could fix almost anything, but were currently holding a hat that he was turning slowly between his fingers. He wore a canvas coat that had seen better years and boots that were clean but old. He looked at her the way people sometimes look at something that surprises them, not rudely, but with a kind of frank attention that was different from the station master's dismissal or the general store owner's arithmetic. "Morning," he said. "Is this the Pratt place?" "It is," Margaret said. She kept the feed bucket between them out of habit. "Mrs. Pratt is inside. Are you expected?" "No, I'm not." He turned his hat once more. "My name's Nathaniel Crow. I have a ranch about 8 miles northeast. I was in town for supplies, and I heard—" He stopped, started again. "I heard there was a woman at the station yesterday who was in a difficult situation." Margaret looked at him steadily. "Word travels." "It does in Harlan Creek," he agreed. He didn't seem embarrassed about it the way someone making social calls might. He seemed more like a man who had made a decision he wasn't entirely sure about and was going to see it through anyway. "I wanted to make sure you were all right." "I'm fine," Margaret said, "as you can see." "I can see that." He was quiet for a moment. One of the chickens walked up to his boot and pecked at it experimentally. He looked down at it, then back up at her. I also came because I have a proposition. Not, he put one hand up briefly, a gesture that acknowledged the possible misunderstanding before it formed. Not of that kind. A working proposition. Margaret set the feed bucket down on the ground. Go on. My ranch has been without a housekeeper for 3 years. I've been managing alone, which means I haven't been managing well. The house is in poor shape. The food is worse. I've got 7 ranch hands who eat like they're being punished for it. He said this without self-pity, just as a list of facts. I need someone who can run a household, not a servant. A manager. Someone who knows what they're doing. Mrs. Pratt may need me, Margaret said. I know Eleanor Pratt, Nathaniel said. She's stubborn and independent, and she's been refusing help from her daughter and Helena for 4 years. She'll manage. She always does. Margaret crossed her arms. Why me? You don't know anything about me. I know you stood on that platform for 2 hours in the cold after getting that letter and didn't ask a single person for charity. He said it simply, without drama. I was there. I saw you. She hadn't known he was there. She thought back to the platform, the people moving past, the wind. She hadn't noticed a tall man in a canvas coat watching her, but that said more about her state of mind than his presence. I would want a wage, she said. A real one, not something you've calculated to be exactly what a woman in a bad situation can't refuse. Fair enough, he said, and I would want it stated clearly from the beginning what my responsibilities are and what they are not. Also fair? I'll need to speak to Mrs. Pratt first. Of course. She looked at him for a long moment. He had steady eyes, pale gray, the kind of color that didn't change much with the light. He wasn't handsome in any conventional way, too angular, too weathered, with a scar across the back of one hand that suggested an argument with something sharp. But he was standing straight and meeting her eyes, and he hadn't once looked at her the way the general store owner had, as a problem to be calculated. Come inside, she said. I'll put on coffee and we can talk. He held the gate open for her, not in an exaggerated way, just the way a person held a gate when someone else was carrying a bucket. Mrs. Pratt, it turned out, was both annoyed at Nathaniel Crowe for poaching her new housekeeper and secretly relieved, because she had been running her household on stubborn pride for so long that accepting help from a paid stranger was easier than accepting it from anyone she knew. She sat in her armchair and listened to the conversation between Margaret and Nathaniel with the expression of a woman who is pretending not to be interested while being extremely interested. She'll need a decent wage, Mrs. Pratt said, when neither Margaret nor Nathaniel had addressed her. I've agreed to that, Nathaniel said, and her own room, not a closet. There's a room off the kitchen that's been empty since my mother passed. It has a window on the east side. And Sunday afternoons off, Mrs. Pratt added. Every woman needs Sunday afternoons. Eleanor, Nathaniel said, and something in his voice suggested a long history with her stubbornness. I wasn't aware you'd appointed yourself to the negotiation. Someone has to look after this woman, Mrs. Pratt said tartly, since you apparently can't even look after your own house. Margaret pressed her lips together to keep from smiling. She looked down at her coffee cup. The wage, she said. We haven't settled on a number. Nathaniel named a figure that was better than what she'd expected and worse than what she'd hoped, which meant it was probably honest. I'll also want Sundays free, she said, and I'll want to know from the beginning that I'm not responsible for the ranch hands' personal disagreements, their laundry, or anything that happens on the south side of the bunkhouse after dark. Nathaniel blinked. Then something moved across his face that might, under other circumstances, have been the beginning of a smile. Agreed. Then I'll come Thursday, Margaret said. I want 2 days to get Mrs. Pratt sorted before I go. He looked at Mrs. Pratt. Mrs. Pratt looked at Margaret with the expression of a woman who was registering, for the first time in quite a while, that someone had just done her a genuine kindness and had framed it in a way that didn't require her to acknowledge it. Thursday, Nathaniel said. He stood, put his hat on, and nodded to them both. I'll send the wagon. After he left, the kitchen was quiet, except for the soup still moving faintly on the stove and the chickens outside doing whatever chickens did between feedings. He's not what people think, Mrs. Pratt said. What do people think? Margaret asked. That he's cold. That he doesn't care about people. The old woman looked out the window. He's not cold. He's just been alone long enough that he's forgotten how not to be. Margaret started clearing the cups. That's common enough, she said. He lost his wife 12 years ago. Fever, lost a son before that. Mrs. Pratt said it plainly, not as gossip, but as context. The ranch was prosperous once. It's been struggling. He didn't mention that. He wouldn't. Mrs. Pratt settled more firmly into her chair. He's the kind of man who states what he needs and doesn't explain why he needs it. You'll have to figure out the rest yourself. Margaret thought about the way he'd held the gate, the way he'd looked at her, not measuring her deficiencies, but registering her presence as if it was something worth registering. I usually do, she said. She spent the next 2 days making sure Mrs. Pratt's house was in order. She found a girl 2 streets over, 15 and bored, whose mother was grateful to have her earning something, and she paid the girl 3 weeks in advance out of her own thin savings to come every day and help the old woman with what she couldn't manage alone. She made up a schedule, wrote it out clearly, and taped it inside the kitchen cabinet. She soaked the beans, made a pot of them with the ham hock, portioned them into jars. She fixed the back step that had been loose since before she arrived, using a hammer and nails she found in the shed, and her own considerable annoyance at wobbly things. On Wednesday night, Mrs. Pratt called her into the parlor. Sit down, the old woman said. Margaret sat. Mrs. Pratt looked at her for a long moment with those sharp, tired eyes. Gerald Foss is a coward, she said. He's done this before, not with you, with others. 2 women that I know of. He answers advertisements in Eastern papers, gets women to come out, and then decides they aren't what he wanted. Margaret was quiet. I thought you should know, the old woman said. Not so you'll be angry, but so you'll know it wasn't about you. It was about him. I know that, Margaret said. Do you? Margaret looked at her hands in her lap. Most of the time, she said. Mrs. Pratt nodded once, as if that was the most honest answer she'd expected to get. Well, she said, Nathaniel Crow's ranch is a good place, harder than you think and better than it looks. Don't let the hands bully you. The one named Cutter will try. Just ignore him until he stops. Is there anything else I should know? The old woman thought for a moment. The stove in the ranch kitchen has a loose flue. Don't use it in a high wind until you've had someone fix it. All right, Margaret said. And don't let Nathaniel eat standing up. He does it when he's worried. It means he's not taking care of himself. Margaret looked at her. That's a very specific piece of information. I've known him since he was 12 years old, Mrs. Pratt said, with the finality of someone who has decided they've said enough. Thursday morning came gray and cold, with a smell in the air like something distant was burning. Margaret had her suitcase packed and her coat buttoned when the wagon arrived at the front of Mrs. Pratt's house. The driver was a young man, no more than 20, with a freckled nose and the look of someone who hadn't fully decided yet whether he was suspicious of her or not. You Margaret Ellison? He asked. I am, she said. I'm Walt. I work the morning shift on the Crow place. He jumped down and reached for her suitcase. She let him take it. You really come all the way from Ohio? Indiana, most recently, she said. That's far. He heaved the suitcase into the back of the wagon. Mr. Crow said to tell you the east room's been cleaned out and there's firewood already laid. That was thoughtful, she said. She climbed up onto the seat beside him. Mrs. Pratt appeared on the porch, leaning on her cane. Don't forget the stove flue, the old woman called out. I won't, Margaret called back, and right when you can. Margaret looked at her. It occurred to her that Mrs. Pratt, who had been managing alone for years and had refused help from her own daughter, was going to miss her. It also occurred to her that neither of them was going to say this directly, and that was probably correct. I will, she said. Walt clicked to the horse. The wagon moved out into the gray morning. Margaret sat straight on the seat and watched Harlan Creek pass on either side of her. The general store, the barber shop, the 2 old men who were back in their chairs despite the cold, the sign with its crossed-out population. And then the edge of town opened out and she was in the open country, the plains stretching wide and pale under a sky that hadn't decided yet what it wanted to do. 8 miles northeast, Walt had said, 8 miles to whatever came next. She put her hands in her lap, kept her spine straight, and watched the land go by with the eyes of someone who has decided, not without effort, to stay in the present moment instead of rehearsing the past. The note from Gerald Foss was still in her coat pocket. She hadn't thrown it away yet, but she thought maybe she would, when the time felt right. Not out of forgiveness, she wasn't there yet, and she wasn't going to pretend she was, but out of the simple practical recognition that carrying it was weight she didn't need. The road climbed slightly and the plains gave way to grass, and then to something more defined. Hills in the distance, cattle moving slow and dark against the pale grass, a line of fence posts running true and straight toward a cluster of buildings she could see now against the horizon. The Crow Ranch. Walt pointed at it. Home. There wasn't much to look at from here. A main house, what looked like a bunkhouse and a barn, a few outbuildings she couldn't identify yet. But the fence line was straight. Somebody had cared enough to put in a straight fence. That meant something. She sat up a little straighter. She was going to make something of this. She didn't know exactly what, or how long it would take, or what was going to be harder than she expected, and something was always harder than expected. But she had work, and she had herself, and that had always been enough to start with. The wagon rolled through the gate. Margaret Ellison arrived at the Crow Ranch on a gray Thursday morning in October 1879 with an old leather suitcase, a note she was almost ready to throw away, and the clear-eyed stubbornness of a woman who had decided that being unwanted was not the same thing as being done. The first thing Margaret noticed when the wagon pulled through the gate was that the porch railing on the main house was held up by a length of rope tied to a nail. Not repaired, not replaced, just held. Like someone had looked at the problem, decided it was good enough not to fall down today, and moved on to something else. She didn't say anything. She filed it away. Walt pulled the wagon up to the front of the house and set the brake. Before he could climb down to help with the suitcase, a man came around from the side of the barn. Not Nathaniel, younger, with a red bandana around his neck, and a look on his face like he'd been told something he hadn't decided whether to believe yet. "That the new housekeeper?" he called out to Walt. "That's her," Walt said. The man looked at Margaret with the frank, sizing-up expression of someone who had no intention of hiding that he was doing it. He was maybe 30, lean, with the kind of good looks that had probably caused him trouble at some point and taught him very little from it. This, she understood immediately, was Cutter. "Huh," he said. Margaret climbed down from the wagon without waiting for assistance. She picked up her suitcase from the back before Walt could get to it. "Good morning," she said to Cutter. "Morning." He didn't move. "You know how to cook?" "Yes," she said. "Last woman they brought in couldn't boil water without burning something." "I'm not the last woman," Margaret said pleasantly, and walked past him toward the front door. She heard Walt make a small sound behind her that might have been a laugh. The inside of the main house was worse than the porch railing had suggested. It wasn't dirty, exactly. Someone had been sweeping and managing the basics. But it had the particular neglect of a place where a person lives alone and has stopped noticing what's wrong. The curtains in the front room were thick with dust. The wood stove in the kitchen had a grease buildup around the lower vent that she could see from the doorway. The table had 3 chairs when it should have had 4, and somebody had been using a crate as the 4th for long enough that it had left a permanent mark on the floor. She set her suitcase down and stood in the kitchen and did what she always did when she arrived somewhere new. She looked at everything once, slowly, to understand what she was actually dealing with rather than what she'd been told. The pantry had enough food for several days, but no system. Cans were mixed with dry goods, which were next to what appeared to be a tin of harness oil, which had no business being in a kitchen at all. The water barrel near the back door was almost empty. Someone had left a coffee pot on the stove with what appeared to be several days of coffee accumulated in it, dark and thick as road tar. She heard boots on the porch, and Nathaniel Crow came in through the front door, pulling off his hat. He looked at her, standing in his kitchen doorway, and something in his expression shifted, as if he'd made the decision to hire her but hadn't quite gotten used to the reality of it yet. "You made it," he said. "I said I would," Margaret replied. He looked at the kitchen the way people look at something they have stopped seeing. "Walt showed you the East Room?" "Not yet. I wanted to look at the kitchen first." A pause. "And?" "The flue is loose," she said. "Mrs. Pratt warned me. I won't use the stove in high wind until it's fixed. Also, there's harness oil in the pantry that needs to go back to wherever it came from, the water barrel needs filling, and the coffee pot is a genuine hazard. She said it without heat, as a list. The rest I can manage. Nathaniel looked at the coffee pot. I make it strong, he said. There's strong coffee, and then there's whatever that is, Margaret said. Where's the east room? He showed her. It was down a short hallway off the kitchen, past the pantry, exactly where he'd described. It had a single window on the east wall, a narrow bed with a quilt that had seen better decades, a hook on the wall for her coat, and a small dresser with a drawer that stuck. The firewood was already laid in the small iron stove in the corner. It smelled like cold air and sawdust and old wood. It was adequate. It was hers. Thank you, she said. Supper's usually at 6, he said. The hands come in from the south field by 5:30. There are 7 of them, including Walt and Cutter. I know about Cutter, she said. Nathaniel looked at her. Mrs. Pratt? She was helpful. Margaret set her suitcase on the bed. Is there anything particular any of them won't eat? One of them, a man named Pete Odom, can't eat onion, makes him sick. He won't say so, he'll just push his plate away and act like the food is bad. Good to know, she said. Anything else? He thought about it with the seriousness of someone who had been asked to summarize a complicated situation. They're not bad men, he said finally. They just don't know how to behave when something changes. Neither does anyone, Margaret said. She began unpacking her suitcase. I'll have supper ready at 6. He stood in the doorway for a moment, the way people do when they've said what they came to say, but aren't quite ready to leave. Then he put his hat back on and went out. She unpacked. She put her 2 dresses on the hook, her work boots under the bed, her husband's pocket watch on the dresser where she could see it. She opened the tin of buttons and set it beside the pocket watch, because having something beautiful in a plain room made the room less plain. Then she went to work. She started with the coffee pot because it was the most immediate problem, and because solving the most immediate problem first was how you kept from being overwhelmed. She found a rag, boiled water, and cleaned the pot until it looked like a coffee pot again, and not a geological formation. She filled the water barrel from the pump in the yard, 2 trips with the heavy bucket, which made her arms ache in a way that reminded her she was going to have to rebuild her physical strength here. She moved the harness oil out to the barn, where a young hand she hadn't met yet looked at her carrying it like she'd walked out of the wall. Found this in the kitchen, she said. Oh, he said, I've been looking for that. Now you found it, she said, and went back inside. By mid-afternoon, she had the pantry organized, the kitchen surfaces clean, a pot of beef broth going on the stove that, carefully, with the window cracked to watch the flue draw, and a reasonable understanding of what she had to work with for the next week. The cellar under the house had potatoes, turnips, a few jars of preserved tomatoes, and smoked pork on hooks that was good but getting old. The dry goods were better than she'd expected. Someone had been buying competently, if not cooking that way. At 4:30, she was rolling out biscuit dough when the back door opened and Cutter came in without knocking. What's for supper? He asked. Knock, she said without looking up. A pause. What? When you come into the kitchen, knock first, same as you'd knock on any door. It's not your kitchen, Cutter said. Margaret set down the rolling pin and looked at him directly. It is my kitchen, she said with perfect calm. Mr. Crow hired me to run it, and I'm running it. When you knock, I'll answer and I'll tell you what's for supper. Until then, you'll wait. Cutter stared at her. She held his gaze without blinking or shifting her weight. It was a long moment. He was young enough and proud enough that this could have gone several ways. Then something behind his eyes decided it wasn't worth the energy, and he stepped back through the door and knocked on the frame from outside. Better, she said. Beef stew and biscuits. Any pie? He asked through the door. Not tonight. Walt said the last woman. I'm not the last woman, Margaret said again, and picked up the rolling pin. She heard him make a sound that might have been a grudging half-laugh, and then his boots retreated across the porch. Supper at 6 went roughly. This was expected. The 7 hands filed in with the managed chaos of men who had been eating together long enough to have established an order, and the addition of a woman standing at the stove disrupted it in a way that none of them would have been able to explain, but all of them felt. They were not rude, mostly. They were uncertain, which expressed itself as either silence or overcompensating commentary. The man who turned out to be Pete Odom sat at the far end of the table and looked at the stew with the focused attention of someone checking for something. The stew had no onion. He ate 2 bowls without comment. Nathaniel sat at the head of the table and ate the way Mrs. Pratt had warned her about, quickly, standing for the first several minutes before he seemed to register that there were chairs and that he was in one. "This is good," said a hand named Frank, with the surprise of someone who hadn't intended to give a compliment. "Thank you," Margaret said. "The last woman couldn't—" "Frank," Nathaniel said without inflection. Frank stopped talking. After supper, the hands went back to the bunkhouse and Margaret cleaned the kitchen. It was past 8 by the time she finished. Her hands were red and her back had its own opinions about the day. She sat down at the kitchen table for the first time since she'd arrived, and she drank a cup of tea, and she looked at the room she had spent the day working in. It looked like a kitchen now. That was something. Nathaniel came in from checking the stock. He stopped when he saw her sitting there, as if he'd expected the kitchen to be empty by now. "There's tea," she said, "if you want it." He looked at the kettle. "I usually have whiskey." "That's your business," she said. "I put the kettle on anyway." He sat down across the table from her and poured tea into a cup with the expression of a man who was doing something slightly foreign to himself but was willing to try it. He drank it without speaking. Outside, the wind had picked up again, working at the window over the basin. "The flue needs fixing," he said. "I know. I said so this morning. I'll have Walt look at it this week." "Walt fixes things?" Margaret asked. "Walt fixes some things. Badly, but eventually. Can he be relied on for the stove, or should I ask someone else?" Nathaniel thought about it. "There's a man in town, a blacksmith named Devers. He's done the flue before. I'll send for him." "Thank you," she said. Another silence. It was not an uncomfortable silence, which surprised her slightly. Nathaniel Crowe had the quality of someone who didn't fill quiet with noise just because it was there, and she had spent enough time around people who did to find this restful. "How long has the ranch been short-handed?" she asked. He looked up. "What makes you think it is?" "7 hands for this acreage is not enough," she said. "The Southfield fence I saw from the wagon needs work and nobody's gotten to it. The harness that was left in the kitchen pantry suggests someone's been doing tack repair inside during cold weather, which means the barn doesn't have adequate shelter for working in winter. And there are 8 horses in the corral, but only 5 saddles on the rack in the barn." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "You counted the saddles." "I walked past the barn to get to the pump," she said. "I noticed things." He set down his cup. He looked at the table for a moment, then at her. 3 years, he said. "It's been going short for 3 years." "Since your last housekeeper left?" "Before that." He said it without elaboration, the way he said most things, but there was something behind it that she didn't push on. "Not yet." She stood and took her cup to the basin. "Good night, Mr. Crowe." "Nathaniel," he said. She turned. He was looking at the table. People who work here don't call me Mr. Crowe," he said. "It sounds strange." "All right," she said. "Good night, Nathaniel." She went down the hall to her room. She heard him sit at the table for a while longer. She could tell by the absence of footsteps, the quiet. And she thought about what Mrs. Pratt had said about a man who had been alone long enough to forget how not to be. The next 2 weeks were a negotiation, though nobody used that word. Margaret established the kitchen rules in the first 3 days and defended them without escalating and without softening them. Knock before entering, no plates taken from the kitchen without being returned, no one touches what's on the stove without asking. By the end of the first week, all 7 hands knocked. By the end of the second, most of them did it automatically, the way you develop habits around any force of nature that has made its position clear. Cutter was the last. He knocked on the 8th day, loudly and with a dramatic formality that was meant to be funny, and she told him his biscuits were on the counter and he could take 2, which was the same as every other morning, and something in the transaction settled whatever he'd been deciding about her. The work itself was relentless. She was up before 5 to start the stove and have coffee ready before the morning shift went out. Breakfast for 9 people, then cleaning, then inventory and planning, then the noon meal, then whatever needed doing in the afternoon. Mending, accounts, The endless business of keeping a household from sliding back into disorder. Supper at 6. Kitchen clean by 8. In bed by 9, if she was lucky. Her body hurt in ways it hadn't hurt in years. Not the dull ache of sedentary unhappiness she'd carried in St. Louis, but the clean, functional pain of actual physical work. Her hands were rough. Her shoulders were sore. She slept without dreams, which she counted as a mercy. On the 15th day, she found the accounts. Nathaniel had not asked her to look at them. She'd gone into the small room off the front hall that served as his office to find paper for her weekly supply list, and the ledger was open on the desk. She wasn't snooping. The ledger was right there, open, and the numbers on the page were large and dark enough to read at a distance. She didn't read past what she could see standing in the doorway. But what she could see was enough to understand that the ranch's financial situation was considerably more difficult than short-handed work had suggested. She took her paper, went back to the kitchen, wrote her supply list, and thought about it. That evening, after supper, when the hands had gone and Nathaniel was doing his customary check of the stock before coming in, she laid out his accounts ledger on the kitchen table and waited. He came in, pulled off his coat, and stopped when he saw it. "That was in my office," he said. "It was open on your desk," she said. "I was looking for paper. I didn't read through it. I only saw what was on the open page." He looked at the ledger, then at her. His expression was not angry, but it was careful. "I'm not asking about your finances," she said. "I'm telling you that what I saw concerned me, and I think you should know that someone in your household has seen it. If you'd like to move the ledger to somewhere more private, that's reasonable. I only wanted to tell you directly instead of pretending I hadn't seen." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He put his hands flat on the table on either side of the ledger. He didn't open it. "It's bad," he said after a moment. "Yes," she said. "I took out loans 3 years ago to cover a bad winter. The cattle losses were worse than I told anyone. I've been paying the loans down, but the interest is—" He stopped. "It's manageable." She looked at him. He looked at the ledger. "What would help?" she asked. I'm not offering charity," she said. "I managed books for 11 years. I'm asking what kind of help would be useful." Another of those long pauses where she'd learned to wait him out. "The supply costs are high," he said finally. "I buy from the general store in town because it's where I've always bought. There's a cooperative in Helena that has better rates, but the minimum order is large and the timing is complicated." "Let me look at the numbers," she said. "I know it's not my problem," she said. "I'm asking if you'll let me look." He pushed the ledger toward her. She pulled it closer and opened it to the supply accounts. He sat across the table and watched her read, which most people found uncomfortable and she had never particularly minded. Numbers told stories if you knew how to read them, and she did. She read for 20 minutes. Nathaniel sat and drank his whiskey and didn't speak, which she appreciated. "Your feed costs alone are 30% higher than they need to be," she said finally. "And you're paying the same rates you paid in 1874. You haven't renegotiated." "I don't—" He stopped. "I'm not good at renegotiating." "Are you good at keeping a ranch running while someone else renegotiates?" He looked at her for a long moment. "You'd do that?" "Not without your authority and not without knowing exactly what you can and can't accept," she said. "But yes, if you want me to." He was quiet again, but this time the quality of the quiet was different. There was something working behind his eyes that she was starting to recognize, that not reluctance, but the careful weighing of someone who had made the mistake of trusting the wrong people before and was deciding whether the cost of trusting again was worth it. "Let me think on it," he said. "Of course," she said, and closed the ledger. She had been at the ranch for 3 weeks when Walt caught his hand in the fence wire and tore a gash across the palm that needed closing. She sewed it in the kitchen while Walt gripped the table and tried not to make noise, which he mostly managed. It took 8 stitches, and he didn't look at his hand once. "You been a nurse?" he asked when she was tying off the last stitch. "No," she said, "but I raised 3 children and ran a house. Eventually you learn to close a wound." That's something," he said faintly. "Hold this." She pressed a clean cloth against the stitches. "How long have you worked here?" 4 years, he said, still not looking at the hand. "Came up from Wyoming. My father worked cattle his whole life. I figured I would too." Do you like it? He thought about it. Some days, he said. Today is not one of them. She tied the bandage and he flexed his fingers carefully, testing the tension. Mr. Crow's all right, he said quietly, as if he was offering her something. Some bosses, they don't notice when something goes wrong with you. He notices. He just doesn't always know what to say about it. That's a fair assessment, she said. When his boy died, Danny, his name was, he was 6. Mr. Crow kept working every day, didn't stop. Some people thought that was cold. Walt looked at his bandaged hand. It wasn't cold. It was the only way he knew how to keep standing up. Margaret cleaned up the thread and needle. Thank you for telling me that, she said. Figured you should know, he said, which was the same reason Mrs. Pratt had told her things. She was beginning to think that people around Nathaniel Crow had been waiting a long time for someone to tell things to. On a Wednesday evening at the end of the 3rd week, Nathaniel came into the kitchen after supper and sat down at the table with the deliberate purpose of someone who had made a decision. The supply contracts, he said. Yes, she said. I want you to look at them. All of them. He set a folder on the table. And tell me what you think. She sat down across from him and opened the folder. I'll need a few days to go through it properly. Take what you need. She looked at him over the top of the papers. He was watching her with that careful, weighing expression, and she understood that this was not a small thing for him. Handing someone his numbers, the real ones, the ones that told the true story of the ranch. It was the kind of thing you only did if you decided you trusted someone. She didn't say thank you, because that would have made it bigger than it needed to be. She just turned to the first page and started reading. Outside, the wind had shifted. The temperature was dropping. Through the kitchen window, she could see the first clouds coming in from the north, low and heavy, with a particular purple-gray color that the older hands would have told her meant weather changing. She didn't look up from the papers, but she noted it. She noted everything. Somewhere between the 1st week and the 3rd, without either of them acknowledging it or naming it, the kitchen had become a place where 2 people worked out problems at a table in the evening, and the house had gotten quieter in a way that was different from empty. The way a room gets quiet when someone's in it who belongs there. Neither of them was going to say that yet. Maybe not for a long time. But it was there, in the ledger spread between them and the kettle keeping warm on the stove, and the way he'd pushed his chair a half-inch closer to the light so he could see the column she was pointing at. It was there. The supply contracts took her 4 days to read properly, which meant 4 evenings at the kitchen table after the dishes were done and the hands had gone back to the bunkhouse and Nathaniel had finished his rounds. He didn't always stay while she worked. The first 2 nights he went to his office, and she could hear him moving around in there, the creak of his chair, the occasional sound of a drawer opening and closing. By the 3rd night, he was sitting across from her with his own papers, doing whatever a rancher did with his evenings when he finally had a place to sit that felt worth sitting in. Neither of them commented on this. It simply happened, the way things do when 2 people have stopped performing indifference and started admitting, without words, that the company was tolerable. On the 4th night, she closed the last folder and pushed it to one side. The feed contract with Burrell's in town is the worst of them, she said. You've been paying 1874 prices with a loyalty discount that stopped applying the moment Burrell's changed ownership in 1877. You're essentially paying full price for the fiction of a relationship that no longer exists. Nathaniel looked up from his own papers. Burrell's changed ownership? 2 years ago, according to the date on the contract renewal you signed. Did no one tell you? His expression told her the answer. The new owner kept the name, she said. Standard practice. Also standard practice. Apparently, to keep collecting on a loyalty arrangement without mentioning it no longer applies. That's... He stopped. Started again. That's a significant amount of money. Over 2 years, yes. She pulled out the page where she'd done the calculation. This number is what you've overpaid. He looked at the number. His jaw tightened in the way it did when he was controlling a reaction he didn't want to show. She'd learned to read that particular tightness. It meant he was angrier than he was going to let himself be. I'll go into town tomorrow, he said. I'd like to go with you, Margaret said. He looked at her. You're going to walk in and confront the man, and it will become a disagreement about who owes what and nothing will be resolved, she said. If I come, we present the documentation. It's different. You think I can't handle a business conversation? I think you're going to go in there already angry, and angry men in business conversations confirm the other man's belief that he's the wronged party. She folded her hands on the table. I'm not angry. I'm just correct. That's more useful. The jaw tightened again. Then something in it released, the way a tight wire releases when you finally relax the tension instead of fighting it. Fine, he said. They went to town on a Friday morning. The ride in was 45 minutes, and they did not fill it with conversation, which by now had become their ordinary way of traveling together, a comfortable quiet punctuated by whatever actually needed to be said. Margaret had the contracts in a satchel on her lap. Nathaniel drove with the reins loose in his hands, the way he did everything physical, with the competence of someone who had been doing it so long that competence had become invisible. Burrell's Feed and Supply was on the main street, 3 doors down from the general store where the owner had told Margaret she had no future in Harlan Creek 6 weeks ago. She did not look at the general store as they passed it. The man behind the Burrell's counter was younger than she'd expected, mid-30s, with the alert, calculating eyes of someone who understood that he ran a business in a small town where every customer was both a revenue source and a social relationship, and the trick was to manage both at once. His name, according to the ownership change document she'd found in the folder, was Arthur Cleves. Cleves recognized Nathaniel immediately, and his expression did the complicated thing that expressions do when a business owner sees a significant customer walking in with a woman carrying a satchel and a look of organized purpose. Mr. Crow, he said, what can I do for you? We're here about the feed contract, Nathaniel said. Of course. Cleves came around the counter. Is there a problem with the quality? I can assure you. The quality is fine, Margaret said. The pricing isn't. Cleves looked at her the way men looked at women who spoke in business settings. A brief recalibration followed by the decision about which kind of dismissal to deploy. He chose the polite version. Mrs. Ellison, she said, I manage the accounts at the Crow Ranch. She opened the satchel and set the contracts on the counter between them. The loyalty discount applied under the previous ownership. When you purchased the business in September of 1877, the original arrangement was with a man named Thomas Burrell, not with your company. The contract was renewed in November of 1877, 2 months after the ownership change, at the same rate. No one disclosed that the basis for the discount no longer applied. Cleves looked at the contracts. He looked at Nathaniel. He looked at the contracts again. That's a common, he started. It's a common practice, she agreed. That doesn't make it correct. She put the calculation page on top of the contracts. This is the difference between what Mr. Crow paid and what the standard market rate would have been for the same period. We're not asking for a refund. We're asking to renegotiate the current contract at a fair rate, and we'd like a credit against future orders that accounts for the difference. A long silence. In it, Margaret could hear Nathaniel breathing, steady, controlled, and the faint sound of someone moving stock in the back room. That's a substantial credit, Cleves said finally. It's a smaller number than what you'd lose if Mr. Crow took his business to Helena, Margaret said. Cleves looked at Nathaniel. Is that a threat? It's arithmetic, Margaret said, before Nathaniel could answer. We're offering you the opportunity to correct a pricing error and keep a long-standing customer. That seems straightforward. Another silence. Cleves picked up the calculation page and looked at it with the expression of someone who has found a math problem they can't argue with. I'll need to discuss this with my accountant, he said. That's reasonable, Margaret said. She put a hand on the contracts. We'll leave copies of the relevant documents. When would you like to reconvene? Monday, Cleves said, a little stiffly. Monday morning, then. She gathered the originals back into the satchel and left the copies on the counter. We appreciate your time. Outside on the street, Nathaniel walked in silence for half a block before he said anything. You said we, he said. We are presenting the documentation. That's accurate. He thought you were He wasn't sure who you were. That worked in our favor, she said. He spent the first 2 minutes trying to figure out the situation instead of preparing a defense. Nathaniel was quiet again. Then, "Where did you learn that?" 11 years managing books for a store where the owner was a pleasant man who was bad at confrontation, she said. "I went to most of the difficult meetings eventually." He stopped at the wagon and looked at her with that careful, measuring expression she'd been seeing for 6 weeks now. It was shifting, she thought, becoming something slightly less guarded. Or maybe she was imagining that. "Lunch," he said. "There's a decent place on the corner." "I saw it," she said. "All right." The restaurant was small and warm and smelled like actual food, which after 6 weeks of cooking for 9 people at 5:30 in the morning was a remarkable thing to encounter without having caused it herself. She sat across from Nathaniel at a corner table, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, someone put a plate in front of her that she had not made. She ate it without rushing, which was also a thing she had not done in 6 weeks. "You're not what I expected," Nathaniel said. She looked up. "What did you expect?" He thought about it seriously, the way he did. "Someone quieter," he said, "or more apologetic. Women who come looking for work usually spend some time apologizing for the fact that they need it." "Does that serve anyone?" "No," he said. "It doesn't." He pushed food around his plate. "The man at the station, Foss. Eleanor told me what he did, what he said in the note." Margaret set down her fork. "Mrs. Pratt tells a great many people a great many things. She told me because she thought I should understand what kind of situation I was asking you to walk away from." I wasn't walking away from a situation," Margaret said. "I was walking toward one. The situation I walked away from was only bad for 2 hours before I found something better." He looked at her. "That's one way to remember it." "It's the accurate way," she said. "The only useful part of that day was meeting you." She hadn't quite intended to say that. Not that directly. She watched him process it. The slight shift in his eyes, the stillness that came over him when something landed in an unexpected way. "Well," he said. He looked at his plate. "Good." They were back at the ranch by mid-afternoon. The letter was on the kitchen table. She knew it was for her before she picked it up. Her name was on the front in a hand she recognized from a long time ago. A careful, slightly cramped script that belonged to a lawyer's office in Ohio. She turned it over and looked at the seal on the back, and a cold weight settled in her stomach. Nathaniel had gone out to check something in the barn. She was alone in the kitchen with the letter and the afternoon light coming in through the east window. She opened it. It took her 3 readings to fully understand the contents, because the language was designed to be difficult to understand quickly, and she had learned to distrust any legal document written that way. The summary, stripped of its apparatus. Her late husband had borrowed money in 1871 from a lending company in Cleveland. He had not disclosed this to her. The debt had accumulated interest. The man had died in 1875, owing considerably more than he had borrowed, and a collection agency, which had apparently purchased the debt from the original lender, was now writing to inform her that as his surviving spouse, she was being held responsible under a provision of Ohio law that was, according to the letter, entirely valid and not open to dispute. The amount they were demanding was not her life savings. She didn't have life savings. It was simply larger than anything she could pay. She folded the letter. She put it in her pocket beside where Gerald Foss's note had lived for 6 weeks. She had finally thrown that note away 2 weeks ago into the kitchen fire on a Tuesday morning. She hadn't made a ceremony of it. She had simply decided she didn't need to carry it anymore. Now she had something new to carry. She started supper because supper needed starting regardless of what the mail brought. She was cutting potatoes when Nathaniel came back in. He came in through the back, knocked. He had started knocking too somewhere around the 2nd week without anyone asking him to, and stopped when he saw her face. "What happened?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. "Potatoes for the stew." He was quiet for a moment. She kept cutting. "Margaret." She set down the knife. She did not turn around immediately. She gave herself the time it took to take one breath and make the decision about what kind of person she was going to be in this moment. The person who carried things alone, which was her entire history, or something else. She turned around and took the letter out of her pocket and put it on the table. He read it standing up. She watched his face and saw the progression. First the concentration of reading, then the understanding of what he was reading, then a slow tightening around his eyes that she recognized from the conversation about the feed contracts. And that was completely different, because this time it was not about his money or his ranch. "Your husband didn't tell you about this," he said. "No." "And the amount they're claiming you owe, I know what it is," she said. "That's not—" He stopped. "Is that legal? Can they hold a widow responsible for a debt she didn't know about?" "According to the letter, yes. I don't know Ohio law well enough to argue with them, and I don't have the money to pay a lawyer to argue for me." He set the letter on the table. He put his hands on the back of the chair, and she could see the effort it took him to stay in the practical part of the conversation and not go somewhere else with it. "I can help," he started. "No," she said. "I'm not offering charity." "I know what you're offering," she said, "and I'm grateful. But no, not with money. I've been responsible for myself my entire life, and I'm not going to—" She stopped, started again. "I'm not going to become something you have to solve." "That's not what I know it's not." She sat down at the table. "I know. I need a day to think about what I'm going to do. I'm not in a position to decide anything tonight." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, not across from her the way they usually sat when they were working. That was a working arrangement, both of them on the same side of the table with papers between them. He sat directly across, like a conversation. "You said it this morning," he said quietly, "that the only useful part of that day at the station was meeting me." "I did say that." "Then let me be useful." She looked at him. The afternoon light was falling sideways through the window, and it lit one side of his face and left the other in shadow, and he looked exactly like what he was. A man who had been managing alone for too long and had found, without planning to, that management was easier with someone beside him. "I'm going to write to a lawyer in Helena," she said. "I have enough for one consultation. I want to know if this debt is actually enforceable before I decide what to do about it." "That's sensible," he said. "If it is enforceable, I'll figure out a payment arrangement, something I can manage over time." "And if you need help managing it, I'll tell you," she said. It cost her something to say it. Not a large something, but she felt the price of it, the small surrender of a pride she had been building for 56 years. "I'll tell you, I promise." He nodded once. He didn't push beyond that, which was one of the things she had come to rely on about him. He knew where the edge of someone's limit was, and he stopped there. They sat at the table for a while without speaking. Outside, one of the hands was calling something to another across the yard. The stew was beginning to smell like it was almost ready. The afternoon had shifted toward early evening. "My wife," Nathaniel said after a long time. Margaret waited. "Her name was Clara. She died of fever in the summer of 1867. Danny, our boy, he went 2 years before that. A fall. He was 6 years old and he fell from the hayloft." He said it without inflection, but the flatness in his voice was the kind that comes from saying something so many times and so many times alone that you've worn all the obvious emotion off it, and what's left is just the fact, like a stone worn smooth. "After Clara, I kept working. People said I was cold. I wasn't cold. I just didn't know what else to do." "Walt told me," she said. "About Danny. I didn't know about Clara." "I don't talk about it." "I know." "I'm talking about it now," he said. He looked at the table. "Because you got a letter that told you something your husband kept from you, and I don't think you should be alone with that without knowing that other people have also had things kept from them, by people they trusted." She looked at him carefully. "What did Clara keep from you?" A pause. "That she was sick. For months before she died, she was sick. She knew it, and she didn't tell me because she thought I had enough to worry about with the ranch and with Danny's accident, and she was—" He stopped. The muscle in his jaw moved once. "She was trying to protect me, and she died before I could do anything about it, and I never got to tell her that I would have chosen differently, that I would have chosen to know." The kitchen was very quiet. Margaret could hear the fire under the stew, the distant movement of the horses. "I'm sorry," she said. "I don't say it to get sympathy," he said. "I say it because I think you understand what it is to have someone decide for you what you can and can't know, what you can and can't handle." She did understand that. She understood it with the particular precise understanding of someone who had just read it in a letter. My husband thought he was managing the situation, she said. He always thought he was managing situations. He was not always correct about which situations needed managing. Were you angry when you found out he'd borrowed that money? I am angry now, she said. I wasn't before because I didn't know. She folded her hands on the table. Anger is a reasonable response to finding out you weren't trusted. I'll allow myself until morning, and then I'll be done with it. Nathaniel looked at her with the full, direct look that he usually kept pointed at problems on the ranch rather than at people. That's efficient, he said. I've had practice, she said. She got up and went to the stove and stirred the stew because it needed stirring and because she needed for a moment to face something that required only a spoon. I was afraid of becoming invisible, she said to the pot. After my husband died, after the children left, the debt is, she chose her words carefully, the debt is the last way my husband's decisions are deciding things for me. And I find that I am more angry about that than about the money. She heard him move. She heard his chair and then his boots, and she thought he was leaving, going to do the evening stock check the way he usually did around this time, but the footsteps stopped a few feet behind her. You are not invisible, he said. Not to me, not to anyone on this ranch. His voice was quiet, the way his voice was when he was saying something he meant too much to say loudly. The hands argue about the food when you're in town for a morning. Walt told me last week that the kitchen is the only place on the property that feels like a house instead of a camp. Cutter, who has said approximately 5 decent things in 4 years of working for me, told me this morning that you make the best biscuits he's ever eaten, and for Cutter that's practically a declaration. She did not turn around. She kept stirring. And He stopped. Something in his voice shifted, found its footing, continued. I haven't had a conversation at that table since Clara. Not a real one, not the kind where you say things that are actually true. I'd forgotten what that was like. She turned around then. He was standing closer than she'd expected, not invading anything, just closer than the ranch's ordinary distances. He looked like someone who had said more than he intended and was waiting to see what it cost him. Nathaniel, she said. I'm not asking for anything, he said quickly. I know the situation. I know you just got a difficult letter, and I know you came here as an employee, and I just want you to know that you are seen, whatever else happens. She looked at him for a long moment. I know, she said. I know I am. You're not very good at hiding things. Something moved through his expression that was close to embarrassment and also close to relief. Eleanor Pratt always said that about me. Mrs. Pratt is a perceptive woman, Margaret said, despite her many other qualities. He almost smiled. It was remarkable how close he could get to a smile without quite finishing it. The letter from the collection agency sat on the table between the folded napkins. Margaret went back to the stew, and Nathaniel went out to do the evening stock check, and the ordinary business of the evening resumed around them both like a river resuming after it has been briefly, strangely, unexpectedly, interrupted by something that changed the shape of the bank. She wrote to the Helena lawyer that night. She chose her words with care, said what she knew and what she didn't, and asked a specific question. She did not dramatize the situation. She simply laid it out. She sealed the envelope and set it by the door to go out with the morning post. Then she sat at the table in the quiet kitchen for a few minutes, her hands around the last cup of tea, the fire low in the stove, the small sound of the house settling around her. She had told him she would allow herself until morning to be angry. That was still the plan. But sitting in the kitchen of a ranch she had made into something that worked, in a house that had started to feel less like an assignment and more like a place, with a letter to a lawyer written in her own clear hand ready to go out first thing, she found that the anger had a different quality than she'd expected. It was not the helpless anger of someone who has no recourse. It was the purposeful anger of someone who knows exactly what the next step is. That, she thought, was different. That was something new. She went to bed. She slept. 3 days later, Cleves from Burrell sent a message to the ranch. He had spoken with his accountant. He was prepared to discuss new terms. Margaret read the message at breakfast. She set it beside her cup and finished her eggs. Across the table, Nathaniel was looking at her with the expectant expression of someone waiting for a verdict. "Monday morning," she said. "We'll go back in." He agreed? "He wants to negotiate," she said. "That's not the same as agreeing, but it's a start." She picked up her cup. Outside, she could hear Cutter and Walt arguing about something in the yard, the ordinary friction of men who worked in close quarters and disagreed about small things as a way of managing the fact that they mostly got along. The fire in the stove was drawing well. The blacksmith Devers had come out the previous week and fixed the flue properly, and she had not had to think about it since. The ranch was not fixed. She was not fixed. The letter from Ohio was still waiting for an answer from a lawyer in Helena, and the supply contract still needed renegotiating, and the south fence still needed work, and Nathaniel still sometimes ate standing up when something worried him, and she still woke at 3 in the morning some nights with the particular cold alertness that came from a life that had taught her not to sleep too deeply. But the kitchen was clean. The accounts were organized. The stew didn't have onion in it, and Pete Odom ate 2 bowls every time without saying a word about why. These were small things. She had learned, over 56 years, to take small things seriously. They were, in the end, what everything was made of. The north wind was picking up. Through the kitchen window, she could see the clouds building again along the ridge line, the same direction they always came from, the same low purple gray that meant weather. She looked at it, cataloged it, and went back to work. The lawyer's letter from Helena arrived on a Thursday, 11 days after Margaret had sent hers. She was in the yard when Walt brought it from town with the weekly supply run, and she took it from him without opening it immediately, the way she had learned to handle things that might require a steady moment. She tucked it into her apron pocket and finished what she was doing first, which was showing the youngest hand, a boy named Eli, who was 17 and had been burning every pot he touched, how to manage a fire for slow cooking rather than fast heat. "You're not trying to boil it," she told him. "You're trying to convince it." Eli looked at the pot with the deep skepticism of someone who had never been asked to convince anything. "Convince it of what?" "That it has time," she said. "That it doesn't have to rush." She adjusted the damper on the outdoor cook fire they used on good weather days and left him watching it with the focus of someone attempting a task they were pretty sure was going to defeat them. Then she walked around to the side of the house where nobody was working and opened the letter. The lawyer's name was Everett Hollis, and he had the gift of writing plainly, which she had not expected from Helena, and which she appreciated enormously. His assessment took 1 page. The debt was real. The provision under Ohio law that allowed collection from a surviving spouse was genuinely valid, though contested in recent case history. The amount the collection agency had demanded, however, included penalties and compounded interest that had been calculated using a rate not specified in the original loan agreement. This was, Hollis wrote, the kind of arithmetic that collection agencies hoped you wouldn't notice. The actual enforceable amount, by his calculation, was roughly 40% of what they had demanded. At the bottom of the page, he had written, "This is still a significant sum, Mrs. Ellison, but it is a manageable one. I would advise a written response disputing the inflated calculation and proposing a structured payment. I can draft this letter for a fee of $8. Please advise." She read it twice. Then she folded it neatly and put it in her apron pocket beside where it had been, and she stood at the side of the house in the November cold for 1 full minute doing nothing except breathing. 40% was manageable. Not easy, not comfortable, but manageable, which was a different country from impossible, and she had learned to know the difference. She went back around to the cook fire. Eli had not burned anything, which was either her instruction or luck, and she was not going to examine which. "Better," she said, "keep the flame steady." She wrote to Hollis that afternoon and enclosed $8 from her wages. The second Monday negotiation with Cleves at Burrell's had gone better than the first, which was not saying much. He'd offered a revised rate that was an improvement, but not a fair one, and Margaret had sat across his counter with the Helena Cooperative's pricing sheet on the wood between them and said nothing for long enough that the silence did the work for her. Cleves revised his offer twice more before they reached a number that Nathaniel, sitting beside her and saying approximately 4 words for the entire duration, accepted with a single nod. Outside afterward, on the street, Nathaniel had looked at her with an expression she hadn't quite seen on him before. "How do you do that?" he asked. "Do what?" "Go silent. Most people can't stand silence in a negotiation. They feel it." "I know," she said. "That's why it works." He was quiet for a moment, which she suspected was him testing the principle on himself. Then, "The cooperative rate in Helena. Were you actually prepared to switch?" "Yes," she said. "Were you?" He thought about it. "Probably not immediately. The logistics are complicated." "I know," she said, "but Cleves didn't." He looked at her for a long beat. "You were bluffing." "I was presenting a credible alternative," she said. "There's a difference." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but belonged to the same family. It was the fourth time she had heard something like it from him in 2 months, and she had started keeping count without deciding to. November came in hard and early. By the second week, the temperature had dropped enough that the water trough was freezing overnight, and the hands were layering up before dawn. Margaret added a second soup to the lunch rotation and started putting extra firewood in the bunkhouse because Cutter, who was the most vocal about most things, was too proud to ask for it himself. She knew this because Walt told her, which was how she had come to know most things about the ranch's internal dynamics. Walt functioned as a kind of informal correspondent between the bunkhouse and the main house, not gossiping exactly, just translating. "Cutter's hands get bad in the cold," Walt told her one morning when she handed him the extra firewood to bring across. "He had some kind of accident when he was young. He doesn't talk about it." "I know his hands are stiff," she said. "I've watched him with the harness for 3 weeks." Walt looked at her. "You noticed that?" "I notice things," she said. "Take the wood." The morning the first real storm came, Nathaniel was already up when she got to the kitchen at 5:15. This was unusual. He was a man who slept with the discipline of someone who understood that running a ranch on insufficient rest was how ranchers made expensive mistakes, and he was generally in bed until 5:30. He was standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee he'd made himself, badly, she could see from the color, looking out at the dark yard. "It's coming," he said, without turning around. She came to stand beside him at the window. The yard was still, the way it gets still before weather, a held-breath quality to the air that she had come to recognize in her 8 weeks here. The sky to the north, just barely visible above the tree line, had that purple-black density that meant business. "How bad?" she asked. "Bad," he said. "There's a herd of 60 that wintered in the north pasture last year. I want to move them closer in today before it hits." He turned from the window. "That means I need all the hands on the north drive by 6, which means I'll have breakfast ready in 20 minutes, she said. "Go wake them up." He went. She started the stove and worked fast, the kind of fast that was different from rushed, every motion purposeful and in the right order, the way she had cooked since she was 19 and had learned that panic in a kitchen produced bad food and wasted time. Biscuits in the oven, salt pork in the pan, eggs when the men were sitting down. They ate quickly and without their usual noise, because weather was coming and they knew it, and they went out while it was still dark. By 8 in the morning, the wind had picked up. By 10, the first snow was coming in sideways, and the temperature had dropped 15 degrees in 2 hours, which was the kind of drop that killed cattle and injured men and turned a manageable situation into a dangerous one while you were still deciding how to respond. Nathaniel had sent Walt back at 9 with a message. The north herd was moving slow, and they were going to need most of the day. He would not be back until the herd was secure. If conditions worsened significantly before then, Margaret should use her own judgment about the house and the animals still in the near corral. She read the message. She looked out the window at the snow. She put the message on the table and thought about what use your own judgment meant in practical terms. It meant the 2 horses left in the near corral needed more shelter than the 3-sided lean-to was going to provide in this wind. It meant the firewood stacked on the porch needed to come inside before it got buried. It meant the root cellar door had a latch that froze if you didn't keep it clear, and if it froze, they lost access to everything in it. And it meant Eli, who had been left at the house because Nathaniel had determined correctly that the youngest and least experienced hand would be more liability than help on a cattle drive in deteriorating weather, needed something to do before his anxiety made him useless. She found Eli in the barn, reorganizing a harness that didn't need reorganizing. "Leave that," she said. "I need your help." She sent him for the firewood first because it was the most straightforward and because a simple completed task would help him settle. While he did that, she got the horses into the barn herself. which involved a conversation with the larger of the two, a gray named Macon, who did not like weather and was expressing his opinion about it clearly, that required patience and a length of rope and eventually the bribery of a carrot from the kitchen, which she had anticipated. When Eli came back from the firewood, she set him to clearing the root cellar latch and keeping it clear, checking it every 45 minutes, and she went back to the kitchen and started the kind of cooking that made sense for a storm. A large pot of soup that could sit all day, another pot of beans, bread that would keep, enough for everyone when they came in cold and used up. She worked. Outside, the wind made itself known against every surface of the house, finding the gaps it always found, the ones she had been noting since October and had been slowly addressing with rags and wooden wedges, and in one case a piece of leather tacked over a gap in the back door frame. The repairs were not elegant. They held. At noon, Eli came in from his fourth check of the cellar latch, looking like he'd been worked over by the weather, and sat down at the kitchen table with the relieved slump of someone who had accomplished something small but actual. "It's bad out there," he said. "I know," she said. She put a bowl of soup in front of him. "Eat." He ate. He was 17 and scared and trying not to show it, and she recognized that condition from having raised children through it. "They'll be all right," she said. "Nathaniel's done this before." "And weather this bad?" "He's been on this ranch for 20 years, she said. "This isn't the worst it's been." She didn't know if that was true. But Eli needed something to hold on to, and it was a reasonable statement, and she had learned that there was a difference between lying and offering a credible frame. He seemed to find it useful. He finished the soup. The hands started coming in at 4. Not all at once, 2 at a time, then 3, then 1 alone, then Cutter and Walt together, and finally Nathaniel at 5:15 when the light was already gone and the storm had settled in to stay. They came in with the specific exhaustion of people who had been cold for a long time doing work that required their whole bodies, and they sat at the kitchen table and along the walls and wherever there was space, and Margaret moved among them with soup and bread and the information about who needed to take their wet boots off before she'd let them any further into the house. "The boots," she said to Cutter, who had come in and was dripping on the floor with the satisfied expression of someone who had accomplished something significant. "It's bad out there," he said. "I know, the boots." He looked down at his boots. He looked up at her. He took his boots off with the cheerful compliance of a man who was too tired and too warm and too fed to argue, which was, Margaret had learned, Cutter's most manageable state. Nathaniel came in last. He came through the back, which meant he had put his horse up before coming inside, which meant the herd was secured because he would not have come in until it was. He was snow-covered and pale with cold, and he stood in the back doorway for a moment just breathing, which was something she had noticed he did when he had been out in bad weather. Took a moment at the threshold as if reacclimating to the idea of being inside. She handed him a cup of soup before he had finished taking his coat off. He took it without speaking and drank half of it standing up. "The herd?" she asked. "In the south pasture, all 60. He looked around the kitchen, the soup on the stove, the bread on the counter, the hands eating, Eli sitting straighter than he had been at noon. "You moved the horses." "They were unhappy," she said. Macon took some convincing. Macon always takes convincing. He finished the soup. His hands were shaking slightly, the fine tremor of muscles that have been cold for 8 hours and are beginning to understand that they can stop working now. She noticed it and said nothing about it. "The root cellar latch was clear," he said. "I checked when I came through the yard." "Eli's been managing it," she said. Nathaniel looked at Eli, who sat up further at the table. "Good work," Nathaniel said. Eli's expression was the expression of a 17-year-old who had been told by a man he respected that he had done something worth saying was good, and Margaret looked away from it because it was too honest to look at directly. She refilled the soup pot. She cut more bread. The kitchen held 9 people in a storm, and it held them without strain, which surprised her, and then didn't, because she had been building toward this without realizing it. The stocked pantry, the organized root cellar, the extra firewood, the routines that had made the ordinary days efficient enough that the difficult days had reserves to draw on. This was what she had always done, in every place she had ever been. Made reserves, against the knowledge that the difficult days were coming, because they were always coming, After the soup was done and the hands had gone back to the bunkhouse with their warm stomachs and their wet coats over their arms, and Eli had gone to his bunk with the early sleep of someone who has burned through 3 weeks of 17-year-old energy in one day, the kitchen settled back into its evening quiet. Nathaniel sat at the table with his second cup of something. The whiskey had come out once the work was done, and he looked like a man who was very tired and was allowing himself to be, which was different from his ordinary posture in the kitchen, which was the posture of a man who had things to attend to. Margaret sat down across from him with her tea. "You organized all of that," he said, "while we were out. Someone had to." "I left you a message that said to use your judgment," he said. "I didn't expect—" He gestured at the room, the clean kitchen, the stacked firewood inside, the general evidence of a day well managed. "What did you expect?" she asked. He thought about it seriously. "I don't know, so," he said. "I've been running this place alone long enough that I stopped imagining what it would look like if it was being run by someone competent." "You're competent," she said. "At the cattle," he said, "at the fences and the stock and the land. The rest of it." He looked at his cup. "I've been surviving the rest of it. That's different." She knew it was different. She had been surviving her own version of the rest of it for years. The storm kept on all night. She woke twice to the sound of wind against the house, and both times she lay still for a moment, cataloging. Fire in the small stove still adequate. No new sounds from outside that indicated structural problem, the house solid around her. And then went back to sleep. The third week of November brought a temporary reprieve, 3 days of cold but clear weather, and she used it to do the winter inventory she had been building toward since October. It took 2 days, moving through the root cellar and the barn storage and the dry goods pantry, writing down what they had and what they would need and when they would need it, the calculations she'd been running in her head since the first cold morning. She brought the inventory to Nathaniel's office on the evening of the second day. He was at his desk, working on something, and he looked up when she knocked on the doorframe. "Come in," he said. She set the inventory on his desk. "We have enough to last a standard winter without significant resupply. If the storms run heavy past February, we'll need to consider the feed situation for the horses specifically. The cattle have the south pasture, and I've been accounting for the preserved stores, but the horses are the vulnerable point." He looked at the inventory. He read through it with the same careful attention he gave everything that mattered. "You've been building this since October," he said. "Yes." "You didn't tell me." "I didn't have the full picture until now," she said. "I don't present partial information." He looked up from the paper. "That's a better discipline than most men I've employed." "I learned it from a man who never had it," she said. "My husband presented partial information constantly, optimistic partial information. It caused problems." "The debt," he said, "among other things." She pulled out the chair across from his desk and sat down. Hollis wrote again. "The collection agency accepted the disputed calculation. The amount I actually owe is—" She told him the number. "I'm going to start paying it down in January, $50 a month. It'll take time, but it's manageable." Nathaniel was quiet. He looked at the number she'd written at the bottom of the inventory page where she'd noted it. "I want to offer you a wage increase," he said. She looked at him. "Because of the debt?" "No," he said. "Because of this." He held up the inventory. "And the Burrell's negotiation, and the fact that the ranch came through a 2-day storm last week with no losses and a full kitchen because you spent 2 months building toward exactly that." He put the paper down. "I've been underpaying you since October. I want to correct that." She considered it. It was not charity. She could see that clearly, the distinction he was drawing, the same distinction she had drawn herself when she'd told him she would accept help with the debt only when she needed it. This was different. This was a transaction between people who both understood the value of work. "All right," she said. Something in his expression shifted. She thought maybe he had expected her to argue and was recalibrating. "There's something else," she said. "Yes?" She had been thinking about how to say this for several days and had not found a version that didn't require saying it plainly, so she said it plainly. "The way the ranch is structured, the supply costs and the loan repayments and the winter margins, it's manageable now. But only barely. One bad season, a real one, worse than last week, could put you back where you were 3 years ago. She kept her eyes on his. I want to look at the long-term accounts, not just the supply contracts, the full picture, the loans, the repayment schedule, the projected income through spring. I want to help you build something that doesn't depend on everything going approximately right. He was very still. That's more than I hired you for, he said. I know. You're talking about the whole of it, the business of the ranch. Yes, she said. I am. The silence between them was the longest one they'd had in 2 months of evenings at the kitchen table, and she held it the way she had held the silence in Cleves' store, without flinching and without filling it. Why? He said finally. Not suspicious, genuinely asking. She thought about the honest answer, which was complicated, and then she chose the part of it that was both honest and complete. Because I have lived my entire life in places that were temporary, she said. Because I have been competent in the service of other people's futures and careless about my own. And because this place... She stopped, started again. This is the first place in a very long time where I feel like what I do matters past the end of the day. And I don't want to watch it become less than it should be because the numbers weren't managed well, when I can manage them. He looked at her for a long time. Outside, the wind had picked up again. Not storm weather this time, just Montana in November, reminding everyone of its general position. You said this place, he said. I did. Not the ranch. No, she said. Not the ranch. He looked at the desk. He looked at the inventory she'd brought him. He looked at the window. The full accounts are in the bottom drawer, he said. On the left. There's a second ledger under the green folder that has the loan details. She stood. She went to the drawer and found the ledger and the green folder, and when she straightened up, he was watching her with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not the careful weighing, not the controlled tightness, not the almost smile. Something more unguarded than any of those. She did not comment on it. She took the ledger back to the kitchen table where the light was better, and she opened it, and she started reading. An hour later, she heard his boots in the hallway. He appeared in the kitchen doorway with the whiskey and 2 cups, which was new, and he sat down across from her without being invited, which by now needed no invitation. She pointed at a number in the ledger. This interest rate, she said. He leaned forward to look at it. His shoulder was close to hers, the way it got when they were both looking at the same page. She had stopped noticing this at some point in the past month. She noticed it now. The bank in Helena, he said. It was the best rate I could get in 1876. It's not the best rate available now, she said. The Territorial Bank has been offering better terms for 2 years. I saw it in the Helena paper that Walt brought back last week. He was quiet, looking at the number. Refinancing, she said. If the terms are what the paper suggested, you'd save roughly... She did the calculation in her head, then wrote it on the page beside the number. That, per year. He looked at the number she'd written. Then he looked at her close, the way you look at someone when you've run out of the distance you were keeping. Margaret, he said. Yes, she said, which was not an answer to a question, but was an answer to something. I don't know what I'm going to do about the fact that you're here, he said. I've been trying to figure that out for 2 months. She looked at the ledger. Then she looked at him. You don't have to do anything about it, she said. I'm not going anywhere. He absorbed that. She watched him absorb it, the way good information settles into a person who has been operating without it. Outside, the November wind kept up its conversation with the corners of the house. Inside, the fire was steady, and the kitchen was warm, and the lamp threw its circle of light across 2 people and an open ledger, and whatever was being built between them was being built the way everything real gets built. Slowly, out of ordinary materials, one honest day at a time. The refinancing took 6 weeks to arrange, which was faster than Margaret had expected and slower than Nathaniel had hoped, which put them exactly where most things between them ended up. Somewhere in the middle, workable, neither of them entirely satisfied, but both of them committed to the outcome. She wrote the initial letter to the Territorial Bank in Helena. Nathaniel reviewed it and changed 2 words, which was how she knew he had read it carefully. They sent it in December and received a response in January requesting a meeting, and on the 14th of January, 1880, they drove into Helena in the ranch wagon with the full accounts ledger, the original loan documents, and a summary Margaret had prepared that laid out the ranch's current position, its liabilities, and its reasonable projected income through spring in 4 clean pages that said everything necessary and nothing that wasn't. The banker's name was Sorensen. He was a careful, dry-mannered man of about 60, who read the summary with the focused attention of someone who had seen many ranch owners come through his door and had learned to distinguish between the ones who understood their own situation and the ones who were hoping he wouldn't notice that they didn't. He read it through once. Then he looked up at Margaret. "You prepared this?" "Yes," she said. "Are you Mr. Crow's accountant?" "I manage the household and accounts," she said. Sorensen looked at Nathaniel. "She's good," he said, as if Nathaniel might not have noticed. "I know," Nathaniel said. The meeting took 2 hours. The terms Sorensen offered were not as good as the newspaper had suggested, which Margaret had half expected. Newspaper rates were advertisements, not promises, but they were considerably better than the existing loan, and more importantly, the repayment structure was one she could build a realistic schedule around. She negotiated 2 points of the arrangement directly, while Nathaniel sat beside her with his hands folded on the table and the expression of a man who has made the decision to let someone else lead and is finding it more comfortable than he anticipated. On the road back to Harlan Creek, the afternoon light low and white across the snow-covered plains, Nathaniel was quiet for the first several miles. "You argued with him," he said finally. "I disagreed with 2 of his proposed terms," she said. "That's different from arguing." He looked surprised. "Men in banking often look surprised when women disagree with their proposed terms," she said. "It doesn't mean they're right to be surprised. It just means they are." Nathaniel was quiet again. Then, "He gave us the better rate on the repayment schedule." "Yes," she said. "Because of you." "Because the number supported it, and I said so clearly," she said. "He's a reasonable man. Reasonable men respond to clear numbers. It just took someone willing to say them." She could feel him looking at her from the side, that direct attention she had learned to recognize as his particular version of consideration. Not casual, never casual, but not intrusive either. The way he looked at the land when he was trying to understand what it needed. "I have something I want to ask you," he said. She kept her eyes on the road ahead. "All right." "Not today," he said. "Not on the road, but soon." She understood what he meant. She had understood the direction of things for some time, the same way you understand a season is changing before the calendar confirms it, by the quality of the light, the behavior of the air, the accumulation of small signs that individually mean nothing and together mean everything. "All right," she said again. He asked her on a Sunday in February. Sunday afternoons were hers, by the arrangement they'd made in October and had never renegotiated. She usually spent them in her room writing letters or reading, or doing whatever small personal tasks the week had crowded out. On this particular Sunday, she was at the kitchen table with a letter to her youngest daughter, Eleanor. Not Mrs. Pratt's Eleanor, her own, the one in Kansas, who wrote 4 times a year and whom she loved with the particular complicated love of a mother whose children had become strangers through distance and time and the ordinary attrition of lives that had moved in different directions. Nathaniel knocked on the kitchen door frame. He had started knocking everywhere in the house, which she had never asked him to do, and which had happened gradually, like most things about him changed. Slowly, then all at once. "Can I come in?" he asked. "It's your kitchen," she said. "You've said that's not accurate," he said. She set down her pen. "Come in?" He came in and sat across from her, not at an angle the way he sometimes sat when they were working, but straight across, directly. He had his hat in his hands, and he was turning it, which she had not seen him do since the first morning he came around the side of Mrs. Pratt's house through the gate. She waited. "I'm going to say this plainly," he said, "because I don't have another way to say it, and I've tried to find one for 3 months." "Plain is fine," she said. "I want to marry you," he said. "Not because the ranch needs a manager, though you are the best one I've ever had. Not because I'm lonely, though I have been for years. In a way I had stopped thinking had a solution. But because—" He stopped. The hat turned once more. "Because the best part of every day is whatever part has you in it. And I'd like that to stop being a coincidence and become a decision. If you're willing." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the steady, gray-eyed directness that had been the thing she'd trusted first about him. before the reliability, before the honesty about his accounts, before the way he'd said, "I don't know what I'm going to do about the fact that you're here," as if her presence was something that required navigation. "I'm 56 years old," she said. "I know how old you are. I have a debt I'm still paying down. I have children in 2 states who barely write. I have an old leather suitcase and a tin of buttons and strong opinions about kitchen management and no particular intention of softening any of those opinions." "I know all of that," he said. "I'm not easy to live with," she said. "I'm organized and I'm direct, and I notice everything and I say what I think, and there will be days when that is not what you want. There will be days when I'm wrong about things I'm certain I'm right about, and I won't figure that out for a week, and by then we'll both know it," he said. "We're going to irritate each other sometimes. That's not a reason." "No," she said, "it's not." She looked at her unfinished letter to Eleanor in Kansas. She looked at her hands, which were the hands of a woman who had worked hard for a long time, and were not the hands of anyone's romantic ideal, but were capable and honest and hers. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes?" "Yes, Nathaniel, I'll marry you." He let out a breath that told her he had not been as certain of the outcome as he had seemed, which she found unexpectedly moving, that he had been nervous, that the confidence he projected in the world didn't reach all the way to this, that there was something in him that still feared the answer could go wrong. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, the hand with the scar from the argument with something sharp, and they sat at the kitchen table in the February afternoon light, and neither of them said anything else, because everything that needed saying had been said. They were married in March, when the worst of the winter had passed and the ground was still hard, but the air had the first thin edge of something less brutal in it. The ceremony was small. Mrs. Pratt came in from Harlan Creek in her best coat, moving carefully on her hip, but moving with the determined independence that was her ordinary mode of existence. Walt stood up for Nathaniel. A woman named Ruth Ames, who ran the town's small school and had become something like a friend to Margaret over winter, through a correspondence that had started as a question about supply costs and become something more personal, stood up for her. The justice of the peace was a bearded man named Alcott, who performed the ceremony with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done it many times and understood that what mattered was not the ceremony, but what came after it. "Chance," Pratt cried, which she denied immediately afterward, attributing the moisture around her eyes to the March wind. "It's a cold day," she said. "It is," Margaret agreed. "Don't look at me like that," Mrs. Pratt said. "I'm not looking at you any particular way," Margaret said. "You're smiling." "I smile sometimes," Margaret said. "It's a recent development." Mrs. Pratt made a sound that was close to a laugh and squeezed her hand hard and went to find somewhere to sit down before her hip made the decision for her. The reception, such as it was, happened in the ranch kitchen, which was the only room large enough for the people who came. All 7 hands scrubbed and uncomfortable in clean shirts. Ruth Ames and her husband. 2 neighboring ranchers who had never spoken to Margaret directly, but who came because Nathaniel was known in this valley, and his choices mattered to people who depended on the stability of his operation. Old Alcott, who stayed for the food. Margaret cooked. She had refused help with this on the grounds that it was her kitchen, and she knew what she was doing, which produced no argument from anyone who had eaten her food for 5 months. Cutter ate 4 biscuits and told her it was the best meal he'd had since childhood, which she suspected was both true and the most personal thing he had ever said to anyone, and she told him there were more on the counter and pretended she hadn't noticed what he'd said. After it was over and the hands had gone back to the bunkhouse, and Mrs. Pratt had been helped into the wagon by Walt for the drive back to town, Margaret stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the yard in the early evening. The snow was almost gone from the near field. The sky was that particular blue that happens in Montana in late March, when the light is longer but not yet warm. A hopeful blue, a not yet blue. Nathaniel came and stood beside her. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I'm thinking." "About what?" "About the fact that I almost didn't come," she said. "To Montana. After Gerald Foss sent that letter, I sat on the train platform and I thought about getting back on the next eastbound train. Going back to Ohio or Indiana or somewhere I'd already failed once instead of somewhere I might fail for the first time. He was quiet. I almost did it, she said. I had enough for a ticket. I could have. And then I thought. She stopped, chose the right words. I thought that there was nothing back there that was worth going back to, that the only direction that had any possibility in it was forward, even if forward was a train station in a town I'd never heard of with nowhere to sleep. I'm glad you thought that, he said. So am I, she said. Most days. He looked at her. Most days? There was a Tuesday in January when the stove smoked for 3 hours because Eli forgot to clear the ash grate, she said. That was a difficult day. He made the sound that belonged to the family of laughs. She had counted 14 of them now, since October. She thought about stopping counting and decided not to. It seemed worth tracking. Spring came. With it came the real work. The work she had been managing toward all winter. The accounts restructured around the new loan terms. The supply contracts renegotiated. The ranch's financial position improved from precarious to something that could, with continued care, become genuinely stable. In April, the last payment dispute with the Ohio Collection Agency was resolved. Hollis wrote to confirm it. They had accepted her proposed payment structure. The disputed penalties had been formally withdrawn, and the remaining balance was what she had calculated it to be, payable over 18 months. She put the letter in the small tin on her dresser, not with the buttons, which had their own tin, but in a separate one she had acquired for documents that were finished with. She didn't tell Nathaniel until dinner. She showed him the letter across the table. He read it. He set it down. He looked at her. It's done, he said. The dispute is done. The balance remains, but it's manageable and it's mine to manage. What was wrong has been corrected. She took the letter back. I want you to know something. What? I didn't resolve this because I had to. I resolved it because I wanted to walk into this marriage without someone else's unfinished decisions deciding things for me. That matters to me. It mattered that I did it myself. He looked at her for a moment. I know, he said. I knew that in November when you said no the first time I offered to help. You weren't offended? No, he said. I recognized it, wanting to handle your own trouble, not because you don't trust people, but because some things you need to do yourself to be able to live with who you are afterward. She looked at him. Yes, she said. That's exactly it. Clara was the same way, he said. It came out quietly, not as a comparison or a displacement, but as a simple recognition. The kind you can only make when you have stopped protecting yourself from your own history. She never wanted help with what she thought she could handle. I used to argue with her about it. Now, I think she was right. She was probably right about some things and wrong about others, Margaret said. Same as anyone. Same as anyone, he agreed. Summer on the ranch was different from what she had imagined in October, standing at Mrs. Pratt's basin washing dishes. It was louder and longer and more physically demanding because summer on a working ranch in Montana Territory meant 15-hour days and weather that shifted from beautiful to punishing inside an afternoon, and the constant grinding work of keeping animals alive and land productive. It meant arguments about the well and a damaged section of the north fence, and a dispute with a neighboring rancher named Pitts over water rights to the stream that crossed their shared boundary, which Margaret resolved by reading the original land deeds, writing a clear summary of the rights as recorded, and presenting it to both Nathaniel and Pitts in the same meeting in a way that left neither of them feeling defeated and established the correct understanding without a lawyer's fees. Pitts, who had come into the meeting with the fixed expression of someone ready for a fight, left with an expression that was harder to read. Not happy, not angry, somewhere in the territory of a man who has been corrected by someone he hadn't expected to understand the situation better than he did. In the yard afterward, Nathaniel looked at her. He'll tell people about that, he said. Tell them what? That you read the land deeds, that you knew what was in them. He was quiet for a moment. In this valley, that's a reputation. I'd rather have it than not, she said. By fall, the ranch had 2 new hands. Nathaniel had hired them in the summer when the work made the need obvious, and Margaret had been the one who interviewed them, which surprised both candidates considerably and surprised Nathaniel not at all by this point. She asked practical questions and one question that was not practical, which she asked both men. What do you do when you're wrong about something you were certain of? One of them said he'd think about it and let her know, which was the wrong answer. One of them said he usually had to sit with it for a day before he could admit it to himself, and after that it was easier to admit to other people. She hired that one. Nathaniel, who had watched both interviews from the barn doorway, asked her about it at dinner. The second question, he said. The one about being wrong. Yes? What would you have done if he'd said he was never wrong? Thanked him for his time, she said. And if he'd said he admitted mistakes right away, easily, no difficulty? She considered it. Same thing, she said. Admitting mistakes easily usually means they're not thinking about them hard enough. Some things deserve to be hard to admit. He pointed his fork at her. I want to argue with that, and I can't. Eat your dinner, she said. Mrs. Pratt died in October, 2 weeks before the first anniversary of Margaret's arrival at the Harlan Creek station. She died in the night, in her bed, quietly, which was exactly how she would have wanted to die if she'd been the kind of woman who allowed herself to want things in that direction. The girl Margaret had hired, whose name was Bess and who had turned 17 over the summer and had proved herself reliable in exactly the way Margaret had hoped, found her in the morning. Margaret went to town for the funeral. She was the only person who cried, which she had not anticipated. She had thought of herself as past the age of being surprised by her own grief, but Mrs. Pratt had been the first person in Harlan Creek to let her through a door when there was no particular reason to, and that kind of thing stays with you. Nathaniel stood beside her at the graveside and did not say anything useful, which was correct, because there was nothing useful to say. He just stood there, which was what she needed. Afterward, in the wagon on the way home, she said, "She told me you had forgotten how not to be alone." "She was right," he said. "She was right about most things," Margaret said. She would have hated hearing that. "She would have denied it," he said, and then said something sharp. "Yes," Margaret said, "exactly." There is a version of this story that ends with grand gestures. A declaration on a hilltop, a town that holds a celebration, a public accounting of everything Margaret Ellison proved to the people who had doubted her. That version is tidier and more satisfying in a simple way, and it is not the true shape of what actually happened, which was less dramatic and more durable. What happened was ordinary and extraordinary at once, the way most real things are. Margaret Crow, she took the name, a decision she made without ceremony and without needing to discuss it, spent the second winter at the ranch managing accounts that were no longer in crisis. She negotiated the Helena cooperative arrangement she had originally raised with Nathaniel in November, which reduced the annual feed costs by nearly a third. She wrote to her daughter Eleanor in Kansas and to her son Robert in Tennessee, letters that were more honest than the ones she'd been sending for years, and both of them wrote back more honestly than they had in years, which was not a reconciliation but was a beginning. She hired a second woman in January, a widow named Frances Oates, 42, capable, who needed work and took the household duties that had been crowding out the accounting work Margaret was increasingly occupied with. Frances turned out to be a better bread baker than Margaret and a less competent bookkeeper, and they divided the work between them with the practical ease of two women who understood that competence in one area does not require competence in all of them. Eli, the 17-year-old who had watched the root cellar latch through the November storm, turned out to have a natural understanding of cattle that Nathaniel spotted in the spring and began deliberately developing. By the following autumn, Eli was leading the smaller drives himself, and the expression on his face when he came back from the first one, tired and filthy and quietly, visibly proud, was the expression of a person who has found the thing they were meant to do. Margaret noticed it at the dinner table the evening he returned and did not say anything directly about it, because some things are better received without commentary. Cutter left in the spring of the second year, as she had always known he would, not badly, not with a dispute, just with the natural departure of a man who had been pausing in one place on his way to somewhere else. He shook Nathaniel's hand and looked at Margaret for a long moment, the way he'd been looking at her since the day she'd told him to knock on the door frame. "Best kitchen I've ever worked near," he said. That's a low bar given what you told me about before, she said. He grinned. A real one, not the calculating one he'd deployed in October, and got on his horse and left. By the second autumn, the ranch was not prosperous. Prosperous would have been putting it too high, and she had learned to be precise. But it was stable. The debts were structured and diminishing. The accounts were in order. The winter stores were adequate. The two new hands had proven themselves. The horses were sheltered properly. The stove flue had been replaced entirely by Devers. Not just repaired, because Margaret had determined that repairing something that needed replacement was the kind of economy that cost more in the long run than the replacement itself. What she had built, she understood, was not a rescue. She had not saved this ranch in the way that stories usually describe saving. Dramatic intervention, a single pivotal moment, one person's extraordinary act changing everything. What she had done was more like what good farming does to soil: steady attention, consistent work, the slow correction of small problems before they became large ones, reserves built against the certainty of difficulty ahead. Nathaniel understood this too, she thought, not in the way he would have articulated it, because he was not a man who articulated much, but in the way he moved through the ranch now, with the quality of someone who has stopped bracing against the next catastrophe because the ground beneath him has been made more solid. On an evening in October of the second year, the anniversary of her arrival in Montana, she sat on the porch step with a cup of tea. The light was the same as it had been the first afternoon she'd come up the road in Walt's wagon. Low, pale, the particular amber that late October puts on the plains before the cold takes it away. The cattle were visible in the south pasture, moving slow and dark against the pale grass the way they had moved that first day. Nathaniel came out and sat beside her. Not on the chair, but on the step, which was narrower and required sitting closer, which was why he'd chosen it rather than the chair. She knew this about him now. "A year," he said. "Just over," she said. He put his arm around her, not demonstratively, but with the ease of someone who has stopped having to remind himself that the person beside him is real and present and intends to remain so. She leaned against him the way you lean against something that has proven its ability to hold weight. They sat and watched the light change over the south pasture. It was not a perfect evening. Her hip was bothering her, the beginning of a trouble she was going to have to manage as the years went on. The north fence still needed 2 sections replaced before December. There was a tension developing between the new hands that she was going to need to address before it became something more than tension. None of these were finished problems. There was no version of life in which the problems finished. But there was this: a woman who had sat on a train station bench in the October cold, certain that she was done, who had instead chosen, without certainty and without a map, to walk toward the next thing, who had arrived in someone else's house and made it work, not through any extraordinary talent, but through the ordinary disciplines of attention and honesty and the refusal to perform smallness when she was not small. And there was this: the knowledge which she had earned and not been given, that being unwanted in one place by one person who lacked the discernment to see what was in front of him was the smallest possible measure of your worth. That worth was not assigned, it was demonstrated. Daily, imperfectly, through the work you did and the honesty you maintained and the people you chose to stand beside. She had spent decades wondering if her time had passed. She understood now that the question itself was wrong. Time does not pass a person. A person moves through time, carrying what they know, and what they know is worth more at 56 than it was at 26, even when the world has not caught up to understanding that, especially then. Nathaniel turned his head and looked at her, and in his face she could see everything that the years had done to him: the losses, the winters, the long silence he had lived in before she had walked through a gate into his yard with a feed bucket and an organized mind and a complete unwillingness to become invisible. "Good year?" he asked. She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. "Better than last year," she said. "Not as good as next year." He made the sound that belonged to the family of laughs. She did not count this one. She had stopped counting somewhere in the summer, when it had become frequent enough that keeping count would have been like counting breaths. Some things you just let happen. The light moved across the south pasture and the cattle moved with it, and the ranch that had been dying slowly for 3 years held itself steady against the October sky. and Margaret Crow sat on her porch step and let herself have it. All of it, the ordinary weight of a life that was genuinely hers. Without apology and without the armor she had worn for so long, she had sometimes forgotten it was armor. She had not been rescued. She had arrived.